Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're heading into dust and danger. Not the Wild West of Hollywood standoffs and charming saloons, but the real thing. The kind of place where your boots fill with gravel before breakfast, and your neighbors are just as likely to be armed as they are hungry. But don't worry, you won't be here long. The odds of you surviving even one full day, let's just say they're not in your favor. If you're new to the channel, or just listening again from a different corner of the world, go ahead and tap that like button, or consider subscribing if you haven't already. It really helps more than you know. And I love reading where you're listening from. Drop a quick comment with your city and time zone, and maybe a note about what you're winding down from tonight. This little global community of sleepy historians is growing every day, and it's always a joy to hear from you. Now settle in. Maybe lower the lights. Let your shoulders drop your jaw unclenched just a bit. If you like background noise, maybe turn on a soft fan, or imagine one spinning slowly above a creaky frontier bed. You're about to take a sleepy, dusty walk through a world very different from your own. We'll move gently, and maybe a little grimly through the day that most modern people wouldn't make it through. Let's begin. You wake up before dawn, but only because the cold has driven you up from sleep. There's no alarm clock, just your own body shivering against the scratchy wool of a hand-me-down blanket. Your nose is the first thing to register the reality of your new environment. It stings, not from the crisp morning air, but from the layers of unwashed humanity that cling to the inside of your one-room cabin. The stench of sweat, old food, wet wood, and something vaguely rodent-like permeates every corner. The mattress, if you can call a moldy sack of straw that is damp and crawling with tiny brown creatures. You've been introduced to bed bugs. The wooden floorboards creak under your boots, or maybe bare feet if you couldn't afford a decent pair. One has a splinter the size of a matchstick, wedged deep in the heel from yesterday's walk to the well. You'll get it out eventually, maybe with a sewing needle you heat over the fire if you're lucky enough to have one. For now, you limp toward the door. You pull it open, and the chill hits you square in the chest. Outside, the prairie stretches out like a promise and a threat. There's a grayness to the sky that suggests a storm, but it could just be smoke from someone's wood stove or something worse. A stray coyote trots past in the distance, unconcerned. You squint toward the horizon, trying to remember which direction the town is in, and which direction the nearest outhouse might be, assuming it's still standing after last week's windstorm. Before you even think about food or fire, you have to deal with another problem. You need to relieve yourself. Indoor plumbing hasn't been invented yet, not in your world anyway. You walk several yards behind your home squat, behind a half-rotted fence post, and try not to think about the lack of toilet paper. Corn husks, maybe. If you're lucky, an old Sears catalog. If you're really lucky, snow. Because at least snow is clean. You return inside, teeth chattering, and finally look around the room. There's no glass in the window, just oiled paper stretched across a wooden frame to keep the wind out. It doesn't work. You can see your breath. Your water basin is frozen over and the kettle's dry. That means another trip to the well carrying a bucket, heavier than you'd like across frozen, uneven ground. But that comes later. First, you sit down and try to warm your hands over last night's embers. You forgot to bank the fire again. The ashes are cold. You curse quietly. Not loud enough to wake the kids if there are any. Not loud enough for your spouse to hear from under the pile of patched quilts. Just loud enough to hear the echo of it, inside your own hollow stomach. Historians estimate that in the 1870s, the average home on the American frontier was under 400 square feet, often shared by 6 or more people. Privacy was non-existent. So was central heating. Your only heat source was the hearth, or a small iron stove if you were lucky, and keeping it burning meant constant feeding. That meant splitting wood, which you haven't done yet, because you haven't eaten yet, because you haven't even survived an hour of this day. You notice, too, the bruises forming under your fingernails, the way your cuticles crack from exposure. You're 30 years old, but your hands look 60. You flex your fingers slowly, painfully. One is infected. It started as a splinter, turned into a pus-filled blister, and now the skin is red and hot. You briefly consider wrapping it with a bit of cloth soaked in turpentine. That's what the neighbor did when her son cut himself last month. He died 2 days later. You're beginning to understand in your bones why the average lifespan on the American frontier barely crested 35 years. Not because people didn't live longer in theory, but because everything was stacked against them. Malnutrition accidents, childbirth, infection, violence, all waiting around every corner. You move about your home now slowly, deliberately, because speed means mistakes. Mistakes mean injuries, and injuries out here are a coin toss with death. You glance at the wall, if you can call it that. The space between logs is stuffed with a combination of clay and straw, called chinking, meant to keep the wind out. It doesn't. You press your palm against the seam and feel a whisper of icy air sliding through. Somewhere outside, a branch creaks, or maybe it's the beam in your roof. Either way, it's not a sound you enjoy. In the distance, you hear dogs barking. Not yours. You couldn't afford one this season. The wolves have been circling closer. A neighbor's cow disappeared last week, left behind only a trail of blood and some torn hide near the creek bed. They blamed rustlers. But you suspect something wilder, hungrier. You step outside again this time to check on the livestock, assuming you have any left. 1 chicken, maybe 2. A goat with a limp. The barn door swings on one hinge, moaning like it's been cursed. You mutter under your breath and push it open. The stench nearly knocks you over. Animal droppings, rotted hay, and wet wood. You gag, then get to work. Later you'll need to walk into town. Maybe trade eggs for flour, or see if the mail wagon finally brought that letter you've been waiting on. Or maybe someone died. The town bell rings just once for deaths. You haven't heard it yet this morning, but the day's still young. And so are you, supposedly. But this world ages you fast. You feel it in your joints, your breath, the way your eyes dart toward shadows without thinking. You're always preparing, always reacting, never relaxing. Out here there is no pause button, only survival. And it's only been an hour. Your stomach reminds you loudly that it's empty. But breakfast on the frontier isn't something you roll out of bed to enjoy. It's something you negotiate with whatever you have left, and whatever didn't get eaten by mice overnight. You open a wooden storage bin near the hearth and find what you expected: a few rock-hard biscuits, a heel of stale cornbread, and some jerky so dry it could double as roofing material. You chew slowly, not because you're savoring it, but because your teeth can't handle more than that. You poke around for coffee, but of course there isn't any. The last grounds were used 3 days ago and reboiled twice. You briefly consider chewing on the wet grounds left in the pot, just for the bitterness, but even that feels like a waste. Instead, you sip warm water, technically soup, though it's just boiled water with a pinch of cornmeal for body. No salt. You've been out for a week. If you're lucky, the general store has some. If you're not, you'll make do. Again, you glance toward the iron stove, which is still cold. Fuel is a problem. You already burned the last of the chopped wood during last night's freeze. So now it's time to collect buffalo chips, dried dung from bison, that roam these plains. You grab a basket and step outside. The air is sharp and your boots, too stiff, too big, rub painfully against your ankles. Every step toward the prairie is a negotiation with discomfort. Buffalo chips, for all their unpleasantness, are a lifeline. They burn hot if not long and don't require tools to harvest, just a good eye and a strong stomach. You gather a dozen, trying not to inhale as you stack them in your arms. You pass the neighbor's place on the way back. Their smoke smells like sage and manure. That's the smell of survival. By the mid-19th century, especially in areas like Nebraska and Kansas, where trees were scarce, buffalo chips were the most common source of cooking fuel. Settlers even held buffalo chip tossing contests at frontier fairs. A strange mix of practicality and gallows humor. It might sound absurd now, but out here every scrap of burnable matter meant one more warm meal or night without frostbite. You return to your home hands frozen and fingers stained. Inside, you stack the chips neatly near the stove and strike a match. The paper you use to start the fire is an old newspaper from 2 months ago. An article about silver mining in Nevada. You read the headline one last time before the flames curl around it and consume the story. Eventually, the stove warms enough for you to place a pan over the top. You toss in a few crumbs of pork fat scraped from the bottom of the tin where last week's salt pork had rested. They sizzle faintly, then die down. Into the pan goes a spoonful of cornmeal mush your breakfast, such as it is. It cooks into something resembling glue, and you scrape it into a wooden bowl. No sugar, no butter, just the ghost of flavor and a lot of chewing. Historians widely agree that the frontier diet was high in calories, but low in nutrients and variety. Pork, cornmeal beans, and coffee, when available, formed the staples. Vegetables were rare except in summer gardens, and fresh fruit was an unimaginable luxury. Food was preserved with salt vinegar or smoke, and spoiled food often eaten anyway, because hunger made you flexible. You sit by the stove and eat slowly. Each bite fills a small corner of your stomach, but not your soul. There's no pleasure in this meal, only necessity. You think back to stories told by your parents or grandparents of the foods they used to eat before heading west. Pies, gravy, warm bread. You push the thought away. That was another world. Outside, the wind picks up. Dust swirls past the window frame. You hear a tin can clatter somewhere beyond the barn, an empty one probably kicked around by the breeze. You finish your mush, then rinse the bowl with cold water and sand. Soap's too precious to waste on dishes. You save it for laundry or bathing when that rare day comes around. You lean back in your chair and stare at the ceiling. The boards are uneven, knotted dark with smoke and soot. One has a crack through which you can see daylight. It reminds you that the world outside never really stays outside, not here. The cold gets in. The bugs get in. Sometimes people too. You make a mental note to patch that gap later today, maybe with some rags and pitch. A neighbor once used a dead squirrel stuffed into a roof hole to block the wind. You had to admire the creativity, even if the smell eventually drove them out of the room. Scholars still debate how much of frontier hardship was due to bad planning versus inevitable circumstance. Some settlers came west completely unprepared, assuming they'd find abundance or opportunity just waiting. Others were meticulous but still overwhelmed by drought disease or the grinding pace of isolation. The truth likely lies somewhere in between ignorance and misfortune. You stand and stretch. The breakfast has warmed you slightly, but now it's time to get moving. The fire needs tending. The livestock need checking. You step outside again and feel the wind tug at your collar. The sky is pale blue now, rimmed with orange at the edges. You squint toward the horizon. Maybe a delivery wagon is coming today. Or maybe not. You think of coffee again. Its smell, its heat, the way it seemed to mean civilization. One of your neighbors once boiled chicory root and told everyone it was better than coffee. He lied, but no one corrected him. Out here you let people believe small things. You fetch more water. The well is 100 feet from your door, and the ground is soft from recent rain. Mud clings to your boots, adding weight to every step. The bucket creaks on the rope. You haul it up slowly, arms shaking. Then again full of cold, clear water. That's a good haul. You count small blessings now the way others count coins. By the time you get back inside, the sun is higher. The stove glows red through its vent, the buffalo chips doing their humble work. You set the bucket down. You'll use half for cooking later, a bit for washing, and save the rest for tomorrow. You stare at the bucket for a moment. It's more valuable than gold right now. There's still no mail, no salt, no sugar, no coffee. But there's water, And that's enough for now. Your body's warmed slightly from the fire and a bite or two of mush, but the real work hasn't even begun yet. On the frontier, there's no such thing as free time, only tasks left undone. You step outside once more, this time with a purpose. The sun's crept higher, casting a pale light over the landscape, though it doesn't feel much warmer. You grab the axe leaning against the porch and make your way toward the woodpile, or rather what's left of it. Chopping wood is not a leisure activity out here. It's survival. Every log split today is heat tomorrow. Every skipped day is a night you might not wake from. You steady a chunk of cottonwood on the stump, raise the axe overhead, and bring it down with a grunt. The blade sticks partway through and you mutter as you pry it free for another swing. Your shoulders already ache, but there's no choice. The wood isn't going to split itself. By the third log, your hands are raw despite the calluses. A blister tears open, and blood begins to pool beneath the skin. You wrap the spot with a strip of linen already stained from previous injuries. It's not sterile. Nothing is. But it'll have to do. According to census records and personal diaries from the 1870s, frontier families often spent hours each day simply preparing for survival, hauling water, gathering fuel, repairing structures. One settler described a typical morning as a rotation of chores that stretched until sundown with the occasional break to nurse a wound or bury a chicken. Time was a tool, but also a trap. If you let it slip, it could cost you dearly. You move from woodcutting to hauling. There's a fence in the back pasture that gave out during last week's storm. 3 slats snapped clean through. You load them into a wheelbarrow, and the wheel immediately sinks into the mud. You curse again, quietly out of habit. Repairing the fence is straightforward, but nothing is easy out here. The nails are rusted, the wood swollen from moisture. You drive the hammer with all your strength, and still the boards wiggle in their posts. You think about how often you've done this, how often your father did, how often your children will if they make it to adulthood. You shake the thought off and push forward. One more chore done. Back near the house, the chicken coop needs checking. 2 hens and a stubborn rooster greet you with a mix of curiosity and indignation. You collect the eggs, 3 warm and speckled, and store them in your pocket like treasure. You used to have 6 hens. Then a fox found its way under the coop last month. You trapped it the next day, skinned it, and wore its tail for luck. It hasn't helped. Now it's time to fix the wagon. The back axle's been creaking more than usual, and you suspect one of the bolts has worked itself loose. You lie on your back in the dirt and stare up at the frame. Mud-dried manure and something else drip from the underside. You don't want to think too hard about what it might be. You tighten the bolt as best you can with the crude tools. You've got a bent wrench and some elbow grease. It'll hold for another trip. Probably. You're starting to feel the wear now. Your arms, your back, your neck. Each motion brings a reminder you're not built for this. Not yet. Maybe never. But you don't get to decide. The land decides. The weather. The tools. The animals. You're just the thing caught in the middle, somewhere between stubborn and desperate. You walk back to the shed for nails. Inside the roof leaks in 3 spots, and you've placed buckets beneath each drip. They fill slowly but steadily. You'll need to climb up there before winter sets in again. That means climbing onto warped shingles and balancing on a frame that groans like an old man when you step just wrong. You glance upward and sigh. Not today. You've already earned more bruises than meals. Still, you try to stay ahead. Every hour's work is an act of hope. Hope that tomorrow won't be worse. That you won't lose another hen. That a storm won't collapse the barn. That a toothache won't turn into fever. That you'll have a reason to wake up again. Historians still debate whether frontier families were driven by optimism, obligation, or sheer momentum. Some argue they were dreamers, clinging to the promise of land and legacy. Others say they were prisoners of poverty moving west, not by choice but by necessity. Either way, once you arrived, the land didn't care why you came. It only asked what you were willing to give up to stay. You've been working non-stop for hours now. It's still morning. No breaks. No shade. You take a swig from a dented canteen and taste rust. You swish the water around and swallow anyway. You sit on a stump to rest, and your body reminds you again how much it resents this arrangement. Your knees crack. Your back pulses. Your hands throb. You remember hearing someone say once, this land will either kill you or make you tougher than leather. You're not sure which you're turning into. Maybe both. The wind shifts, carrying with it a smell you don't recognize. Smoke, yes, but wood smoke mixed with something darker. You stand alert. Maybe someone's cooking nearby. Maybe something's burning. Maybe it's nothing. You don't have time to find out. There's a bucket to patch, a hinge to rehang, a meal to prepare. You move again because standing still feels worse. You shovel out the animal pen, spread new straw, and smear your boots in mud and worse. You replace the broken latch on the barn door. You collect more buffalo chips for tonight's fire. You wash your hands in a basin of freezing water, and they go numb. And when you pause finally for just a moment, when you stand in the doorway and look out over your tiny patch of dust and grass and wire, you feel a strange mix of pride and despair. You've done everything right today. And it's still not enough, because out here enough doesn't exist. There's only not yet broken, only still moving, only try again tomorrow. You step back inside. The stove is out again. You sigh, pick up the tinder, and start over. You pull your coat tighter around your shoulders, though. Calling it a coat is generous. It's more of a threadbare canvas wrap, stiff with years of sweat dust, and the occasional bloodstain, yours or someone else's. You pull it tighter anyway, out of habit, more than comfort. It doesn't do much to stop the wind, but the wind doesn't care. You step back inside and eye your only other shirt, hanging on a nail by the hearth. It's not cleaner than the one you're wearing, just less damp. And it's still crusted at the collar with last week's grease. Getting dressed out here isn't a matter of fashion or even comfort. It's a matter of survival. Your shirt is cotton, rough spun, and poorly stitched. Your pants are heavy denim stiff with repeated wear and hard water. There's a rip at the knee that you patched with horsehide. It holds more or less. Your socks are mismatched and full of holes. And the boots, if they can still be called that, are cracked leather, with soles worn smooth and laces made from twisted rawhide. They were second-hand when you bought them. Now they're barely holding together. Men on the frontier typically own 2 full outfits at most, one for work, one for town, though the difference was usually just fewer patches and slightly less grime. Women had even fewer options. One dress for labor, another for Sundays if they were lucky. Children wore hand-me-downs until the cloth gave out completely. Clothes were repaired again and again sometimes, until they resembled a quilt more than a garment. Thread was expensive, needles precious. Darning socks became a weekly ritual like sharpening tools or mending fences. You wrap a scarf around your neck. It's not wool, just a torn piece of muslin dyed with tea. But it keeps the grit out of your teeth when the prairie wind starts to howl. You adjust your hat, tugging it low. It's wide-brimmed, battered, and stained with everything from bacon grease to axle grease. People today imagine cowboy hats as fashion statements, stiff, clean, symmetrical. Yours is none of those things. It's a tool like everything else you own. It shields your eyes from the sun channels rain down your back, and serves as a makeshift bowl when you find a creek with clear water. Your belt is a strip of leather tied in a rough knot. No buckle. The trousers it holds up are baggy at the knees, tight at the thighs, shrunken from too many washings in cold water and not enough rinses. The buttons on your fly are mismatched, and on one side replaced with a piece of knotted twine. You slide a knife into the side of your boot, not for show, but because you've needed it before. And you'll probably need it again. For rope, for food, for defense. The way you look might frighten someone in a city. But out here, this is how survival dresses. Clothing on the American frontier served a simple purpose: endurance. It had to protect against wind, sun snakes, and splinters. There was no such thing as waterproof, windproof, or wrinkle-free. The only standard was, can you work 12 hours in it and not die? You grab your coat and head toward the corral. The sun's climbing higher, and it's time to check the animals again. You move slowly, not because you're lazy, but because one wrong step could split a boot, twist an ankle, or open a seam in your only trousers. You're always balancing preservation against motion. If your shirt tears again today, you'll be sewing by candlelight tonight. If your hat blows off in the wind, it may be gone for good, and you can't afford to replace anything. As you walk, you remember the smell of new fabric, a scent that doesn't exist here. Everything you wear smells like old smoke-damp wool and the salt of your own skin. You remember what it felt like to have something fit properly. A pair of shoes that didn't bite. A coat that didn't gape at the seams. Those memories feel far away now, part of another life. Some of your neighbors, better off or more fortunate, receive shipments from family in the East. Packages wrapped in paper and tied with twine holding marvels like flannel shirts or wool socks. You heard once about someone getting a fur-lined cloak. You've never seen it, but you like to believe it's real. Scholars still argue whether the clothing on the frontier was truly inadequate or simply the best that could be made under the conditions. Some journals describe settlers shivering through winters in nothing more than patched summer clothes. Others speak of local ingenuity of women who turned flour sacks into dresses, or men who stitched deerskin into jackets, tougher than anything from back east. The truth, as usual, lies in the middle. Some were prepared. Most were just adapting. At the barn, you climb onto a rail and sit for a moment. Your jeans stick to the wood snag on the splinters, then slide off with a familiar tug. The seat of your pants has been patched twice. You'll need to fix it again soon. You wonder if you should just cut up an old sack and start over. But the feed bags are getting scarce. Everything is always getting scarce. You think about washing your clothes, really washing them, with soap and hot water, and a board to scrub them against. But soap is running low, and firewood takes hours to collect. You could use the ash water again, but it stings your hands and leaves a residue. Maybe next week. Maybe when it rains and fills the barrel again. You head back to the house and hang your scarf on the nail your coat beside it. Everything smells of sweat and wind, of the West. You collapse into your chair, the fabric of your trousers bunching uncomfortably behind your knees. The inside seam has worn thin again. It rubs with every shift of your weight. You lean back slowly and close your eyes. You wonder what it would feel like to wear something soft. A cotton shirt from a shop, fresh socks, a wool sweater. You don't let the thought linger. Instead, you reach for your sewing kit, a tin tobacco box with 2 needles, a stub of beeswax, and 3 tangled threads. The day's not over. The patch on your sleeve won't mend itself. The wind's settled down a bit by mid-morning, and that means one thing: it's a good time to head into town, if you can call it that. You throw on your coat again, wince as it catches the sore spot on your shoulder, and check that your small satchel has the things you might need to barter with 3 eggs, a bit of dried tobacco leaf, and a piece of beeswax wrapped in cloth. You glance at your boots, sigh, and decide they're good enough. One last swig from your canteen, and then you're off trudging along a rutted path that serves as a road, only because enough people have flattened it. There's no stagecoach coming today, not unless the river's down and the bridge holds. You'll be walking. Dodge City, or whatever the closest town happens to be, is about 4 miles. Not far unless you're hungry, sore, sunburned, or carrying 40 pounds of tools and goods on your back, which you are. Still, the journey offers something your homestead doesn't: the slim hope of news trade, or maybe even a laugh. As you walk, the dust rises around your boots, coating your pant legs in a thin layer of prairie gray. Every gust stings your eyes. You pull your hat down low and keep your chin tucked in. Along the way, you pass scorched stumps, scattered bones, and the occasional fence post leaning like it's given up. At one point, a vulture circles overhead. You hope it's not about you. By the time you reach the edge of town, you're sweating through your clothes, your lips chapped and cracked. The main street is more like a wide track, lined with shacks tents and hastily constructed storefronts, most with warped signs swaying in the breeze. The first structure that greets you is a saloon. The door swings open, spilling out stale beer fumes, and the kind of laughter that ends in silence too quickly. You keep walking. Towns like Dodge Deadwood and Tombstone were famous for their chaos. At their peaks, they swelled with people chasing cattle contracts, silver veins, or freedom from Eastern judgment. But structure, cleanliness, law, those came much later, if ever. In the early years, a town might grow faster than it could govern itself. Streets weren't paved. Sewage ran in trenches. Buildings burned down and were rebuilt overnight. Everything was temporary except the danger. You passed the jail, really just a single-room shack with iron bars nailed over a window. There's no sheriff today. He's out chasing cattle thieves or playing poker at the faro table, depending on the day and the storyteller. You nod at a man leaning against the wall, rifle across his knees. He doesn't nod back. Weapons are everywhere, on belts, under jackets, tucked into boots. In some towns like Abilene or Wichita, laws required visitors to check their firearms upon arrival. But out here in smaller, less civilized places, the only law is what someone can enforce with their voice or their gun. The idea of a quick-draw duel in the middle of a dusty road is mostly myth, scholars say. But violence wasn't. Ambushes, drunken fights, and back-alley stabbings were daily occurrences. If someone bumped your elbow wrong at the saloon, it could end with someone face down in the street before the piano player hit the next chord. Mainstream historical records from Dodge City, Kansas, indicate that in 1872 alone, more than a dozen violent deaths occurred within just a few square blocks. Law enforcement was stretched impossibly thin. A single marshal might be responsible for policing hundreds, sometimes thousands of restless armed citizens. The job paid little and promised less. Many marshals were killed or simply walked away. You stop at the general store and open the creaky door. A small bell rings overhead. Inside it smells like dust leather and dry beans. Shelves are half empty and prices are scrawled in pencil on scraps of wood. You approach the counter and offer your goods. The clerk, a thin man with a lazy eye, examines your eggs like they're gold coins. He weighs the beeswax. He sniffs the tobacco. You don't bother haggling. He knows you have no other option. In return, you get a pouch of salt, a tin of lard, and a dozen nails. No sugar today, no coffee, no miracle, just the trade. And speaking of what little comforts one could find, here's a quirky yet telling tidbit from those desperate times among the items sometimes found in a traveler's kit, or even offered occasionally by a shrewd storekeeper, were prairie matches. These weren't your neat little boxed matches. Often they were crudely made oversized splints, dipped in a volatile mixture of phosphorus and sulfur, sometimes so unstable they could ignite from friction in your pocket, or even spontaneously combust on a hot day. Carrying them was a risk. But in a land where a reliable flame meant warmth-cooked food and warding off predators, many were willing to gamble with a pocketful of potential fire rather than face a night without. Outside again, the wind has picked up. Children run barefoot through the dust, chasing a wheel with a stick. A woman yells at them from a porch, wiping her hands on a flour-stained apron. The sound is swallowed by the squeal of a pig being led down the road toward the butcher's shack. You turn toward the blacksmith, but the forge is cold. A sign says, "Gone huntin'." You keep walking. You hear music, a fiddle playing a slow, mournful tune from inside the saloon. You hesitate. Step inside, rest a moment. But you shake your head. You've still got the walk back. And trouble finds you faster in places like that. As you head back toward the outskirts, two riders pass you at a gallop, spitting dust into your eyes. You catch the glint of a revolver at one's hip. They don't slow down. You don't expect them to. Historians still argue about whether frontier towns were inherently violent or merely lawless by necessity. Some argue that the West was no worse than eastern cities, just less equipped to handle population surges. Others say the violence was unique, born of desperation, dislocation, and the slow breakdown of old world order. What's certain is this justice was uneven. If you were poor foreign or simply unknown, the town might let you hang for a crime you didn't commit, or let someone else walk for one they clearly did. You leave town with your pouch slung low and your back aching. The sky's darkening with dust, not clouds. There'll be a storm tonight. Not rain, but wind. The kind that rattles your shutters and howls through every seam in your home. On the walk back, you think of how much you didn't get today. No seeds, no thread, no kerosene. But at least you got out without trouble. At least no one followed you. That's worth something. Your boots are filled with grit by the time you step back onto your own patch of land. You unload your satchel, place the goods on the table, and stare at them for a long time. Salt, lard, nails. That's what 4 miles got you. That's what your eggs are worth. You kick off your boots, wash your hands in cold water, and sit by the stove. You think of town, the noise, the danger, the unpredictability. You think of the man at the counter, the rifle on the porch, the way the shadows moved when those riders passed. And then you think about how you'll have to go back again in a few days, because you always do. You don't even have time to rest your feet before the next problem makes itself known. The smell. It's not coming from inside your home, though the inside is no flower bed either, but from outside, wafting in through the open gaps in your window frame and the crack under your door. It's the stench of town, of waste of life, lived with no plumbing, no drainage, and no real plan for what to do with the leftovers of human existence. And on a warm day like this, the air carries it straight to your lungs. You step outside and the smell hits harder. There's a sharp, sour tang to it, part rot, part manure, and part something you can't quite place. Flies buzz around your face. You wave them away, but they come back immediately. They always do. They thrive out here. In many frontier towns, human waste was a fact of daily life, visible, unavoidable, and often deadly. Most homes had no indoor toilets. Some had shallow pits or crude outhouses. But many people simply dumped chamber pots directly into the alley's ditches or the street. It was common to see waste pooling alongside drinking water sources. Livestock wandered freely, adding their own contributions to the ever-growing stew of filth. And people lacking knowledge of germ theory didn't see the danger until it was far too late. You head toward the side of your house, where last week's rain has turned the dirt path into a puddle-ridden trench. That water, it won't be safe to drink again if it ever was. The runoff from nearby homes and barns has tainted it with waste and ash. There's no sewer system, no infrastructure, just ditches carved into the earth, carrying the filth downhill, sometimes directly into the well. If you didn't boil your water, you got sick. If you didn't know to boil it, you might not survive the month. You pass a neighbor's fence and nod as you go. She's throwing a bucket of gray water out the back door, used dishwater, likely cloudy with lard and soap fragments. It splashes onto the ground and runs straight toward a patch of vegetables she's trying to grow. She doesn't notice. Or maybe she does and has stopped caring. You think of the general store again, of how even if you could afford soap, the supply was limited, the quality inconsistent. Many people made their own lye soap at home using animal fat and ashes from the hearth. It worked more or less, but it was harsh on skin and rarely used on a daily basis. Cleanliness wasn't about hygiene, it was about special occasions. By the 1870s, the idea that unwashed hands or spoiled food could transmit disease was only just beginning to take root. Louis Pasteur's germ theory had been published in the 1860s, but its influence hadn't yet reached most American towns, particularly those on the frontier. Doctors still treated fevers with bloodletting. Barbers often doubled as surgeons, and the leading medical advice for digestive illness was to drink whiskey and get some rest. You step into the barn and nearly retch. One of the goats has been sick. You suspect it drank from the standing water behind the corral. You shovel out the soiled hay, gagging as the heat and smell rise in your face. The flies buzz louder in here, drawn to everything, feeding on everything, spreading everything. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery. These weren't abstract threats. They were weekly occurrences. A child might be fine in the morning and gone by sundown. The fever would come fast with diarrhea cramps and hallucinations. Without clean water, there was no defense, and medicine, when available, often did more harm than good. You remember a story from a neighbor about the cholera outbreak that tore through town 2 years ago. 20 people dead in 6 days. The preacher buried them behind the chapel, 5 to a grave. The doctor had no answers. Some said it was a curse. Others blamed bad air. No one blamed the water until it was too late. Historians confirm that epidemics on the frontier were devastating, precisely because of sanitation failures. In 1854, a cholera outbreak in Independence, Missouri, killed over 800 people, nearly half the town's population. The link between water and disease wouldn't be proven until Dr. John Snow's work in London began spreading east. And even then, it took decades for municipal systems to implement proper sanitation infrastructure. You go back inside, strip off your shirt, and wring it out. The collar is stiff with sweat, and you don't even remember sweating that much. You dab at your forehead with a rag that smells faintly of vinegar. That's your closest thing to disinfectant. The vinegar is old, murky, and precious. You ration it carefully. You check your arms and legs for bites. Insect-borne diseases like malaria and yellow fever weren't as common on the Central Plains, but they still showed up, especially near standing water. And the constant presence of lice fleas and mites meant skin infections were a regular inconvenience at best, and a fatal infection at worst. Scholars still argue whether the high death rates on the frontier were the result of poor medical access, environmental conditions, or the failure of early public health practices. Likely all three. In a place where survival was already hard, invisible threats like bacteria made it nearly impossible. You step back outside, cloth over your nose, and pour out the wastewater from your cleaning bowl. It runs in a slow trickle down the slope, joining a stream of runoff that winds past your neighbor's pigsty and disappears behind the barn. Tomorrow it will bake in the sun and harden into a crust until the next rain washes it into someone's well. A dog barks in the distance. Children shout. A chicken squawks indignantly. Life goes on despite everything. You look down at your hands, grimy, cracked, reddened from labor and scrubbing. You've washed them 3 times today. You might be the cleanest person for miles. The wind shifts again. You catch a new smell, now burned bread or scorched beans from a cook fire gone wrong. It's a break from the usual rot. A reminder that even here people are still trying to live, still trying to eat, still trying to endure. You walk to the edge of your property and pour a ladle of water into a trough for the goat. It lifts its head, slowly drinks, and then lays back down. You wonder if it'll last the week. You wonder if you will. You hear the shouting before you see anything. At first it's faint, carried by the wind, but as you step toward the road that leads into town, the voices sharpen into something more urgent. Not casual banter, not farm talk. This is anger, the kind that doesn't settle with words. You know better than to walk toward shouting on the frontier, but you also know better than to ignore it completely. You tread carefully through the dust and down the path until the scene comes into view. 2 men standing 5 paces apart outside the saloon hands near their belts. The tension is thick enough to choke on. Neither moves. A few townsfolk watch from doorways, but no one steps in. No one ever does. One man, young, sunburned, jittery, makes the first move. Not a gunshot. A word. An insult you can't quite catch. The other grins like he's heard worse. Maybe he has. Then before you can blink, it happens. A flicker of movement. A flash of metal. The younger man drops face first into the street. The dust settles long before the sound does. Someone sighs, then returns to sweeping the porch. Life goes on. Despite the myths, quick-draw duels like this were rare but not unheard of. What was far more common were ambushes, drunken brawls, accidental discharges, or cold revenge. Most people carried weapons because they had to. There was no guarantee the law would protect you or even show up at all. Justice in the Wild West was less about fairness and more about proximity. Who was nearby? Who had a gun? Who knew the sheriff? And who had the nerve to act fast? You pass the scene and nod at the bystanders. No one meets your eyes. A block down the jailhouse door is open. Inside, a man, maybe a deputy, maybe just someone who found the keys, is playing cards at the desk. He glances up, sees you watching, and raises his eyebrows like you've just asked him to recite the Constitution. You nod once and keep walking. Many towns had only one lawman, if that. Often the town marshal was someone who'd once worked as a scout, a gambler, or a bounty hunter, rarely a trained officer. Some marshals upheld the law with gritty devotion. Others used the badge as a tool for personal gain. Still others just disappeared when things got complicated. In more remote areas, law enforcement was little more than rumor. A single sheriff might be tasked with patrolling thousands of square miles. And in towns that grew too fast with too little structure, vigilante justice often took hold. A man accused of horse theft might find himself dragged to the nearest tree before nightfall. No trial, no jury, no defense. The rope became the courtroom. In Montana Territory in the 1860s, a group called the Vigilance Committee executed dozens of men in a matter of weeks. Some were guilty. Others, historians still argue. The official record is patchy, the verdicts swift, and the motivations often personal. You reach the edge of town and spot the gallows. They stand like a monument, sun-bleached, weather-beaten, and still used from time to time. You pause, remembering stories you've heard around the campfire, of hangings that went wrong, of necks that didn't break clean, of townsfolk who watched with blank faces, then went home to supper. You recall a man who stole a horse from your neighbor's son last year. They found him 3 counties over, still riding the animal. The posse didn't wait. They left his body hanging from a cottonwood tree with a sign around his neck that read, "Thief." When they returned, no one asked questions. No one wanted the details. The boy got his horse back. That was justice. You start the walk back toward your homestead, the weight of your supplies tugging at your shoulder. But it's the weight of what you've just seen that lingers heavier. You can't shake the image, the man in the dirt, the indifference of the crowd, the way violence blooms so quickly here and fades just as fast. The sun's high now. You're sweating again despite the breeze. You pause near a small patch of trees and sit in the shade, wiping your brow with the inside of your collar. You breathe deep, trying to shake the tightness in your chest. But it's not the heat. It's the sense that the law, such as it is, might protect you one day and hang you the next. Mainstream historical research confirms that many frontier communities operated without any formal legal infrastructure. In some cases, residents created their own codes of conduct, enforced by citizens' committees or informal militias. These arrangements often led to wildly inconsistent outcomes. A prominent merchant might get away with murder. A drifter could die over a missing chicken. Scholars still debate whether vigilante justice was born of necessity or fear. Some argue it was the only option for communities overwhelmed by crime and under-resourced for real law enforcement. Others see it as an extension of frontier brutality, a system that punished the vulnerable while protecting the well-connected. You wipe the dust from your hands and stand again, brushing your trousers off. You've got repairs to make. A window shutter came loose last night, And the wind's only getting worse. As you walk, you hear the gallows creak again in the distance, just a sound in the wind, but enough to raise the hairs on your arms. By the time you reach your home, the breeze has changed. You smell smoke, just firewood, you hope. The chickens cluck nervously as you pass. You toss a few crumbs their way and open your door. Inside, it's cooler, quieter, but no safer. The silence presses in around you. You sit by the stove and stare into the ashes, remembering the man's face, the deputy's blank expression, the crowd that turned away like nothing had happened. You wonder what kind of world you're trying to build here. What kind of safety can be made from silence and smoke? Out here, justice has a short memory, but you don't. Evening falls fast in the west. The light doesn't fade so much as drop, like someone snuffed it out with a blanket. One moment you're squinting against the sun, and the next you're trying to remember where you last left the lantern. Not that it matters. You're almost out of oil and the wick is burned short. You could light a candle, but you've only got 3 left, and winter isn't even halfway through. So instead, you let the darkness settle around you, slow and total. You step outside onto the creaking porch eyes, adjusting to the pale wash of moonlight. The wind has calmed. The air feels thicker, like something's watching. In the distance, a coyote howls sharp, lonely, rising into the sky and then cutting off mid-note. You pause, wait, listen. No reply. Just the usual silence of a land too wide to ever feel safe. This is when most people would be locking their doors. But your door doesn't lock. Not really. The latch works if you jam a stick into the crossbar and wedge it tight. That's as good as it gets out here. The walls are thin. The windows don't close all the way. And if someone or something wanted in badly enough, they'd get in. The best defense isn't wood or nails, it's vigilance. And maybe a loaded revolver within reach of the bed. You move slowly every board beneath your feet, giving a soft protest. You check the livestock again, even though you've already done it twice today. The coop door is tied shut with rope. The goat is lying down, chewing something in the dark, and the old mule is staring into the trees. That makes you uneasy. Animals notice things first. You scan the shadows at the edge of your property, then head back inside. You place the revolver on the table, check the cylinder. It's half full, good enough. Ammunition is expensive, and you don't fire unless you have to. You clean the gun carefully, methodically, the way you were taught. Oil is low, so you use a bit of bacon grease. It's not perfect, but it'll do. You set the revolver next to your bed and sit down on the mattress. The straw crackles beneath you, rough and uneven. You shift your weight to avoid the lump that's grown near the center, probably where the stuffing's settled, or where mice have made a home. Either way, it's better not to think too hard about it. The night chill creeps in fast, seeping through the cracks in the log walls and curling around your ankles. You pull a blanket over your shoulders, 2 thin quilts sewn together from old feed sacks and lieback. Every creak in the walls makes you hold your breath. Every rustle outside sends your thoughts racing. A thief, a coyote, a drifter passing through. People assume the danger in the Wild West happened during the day gunfights in the street. Stagecoach robberies, saloon brawls. But the real terror came at night, when it was too dark to see and too quiet to trust, when your neighbors were a mile away, and the only thing between you and a stranger with a knife was a wooden door and your own nerve. According to official census records and surviving correspondence, many settlers in frontier territories kept weapons close at hand overnight. Diaries mention sleeping with a rifle leaning against the bed, or revolvers tucked under pillows. Break-ins were uncommon, but the fear was constant. With no night watch, no law within shouting distance, and no real help expected, most households were their own last line of defense. You close your eyes and try to breathe slowly. Your body aches from the day's labor. Every joint pulses, your feet throb, and your fingers feel raw. But sleep doesn't come easy here. Your mind replays every sound. The wind moaning against the eaves, the barn creaking as it settles, something scuttling across the floor. You remind yourself it's probably just a rat, or maybe a snake curling up near the warmth of the hearth. You've had both before. Once you woke to find a scorpion under your blanket. Another time a centipede had made a home inside your boot. You try not to think about that now. You lie there unmoving, waiting, listening. Every hour that passes without incident feels like a small victory. Historians still debate whether the Wild West was truly as lawless as legend suggests. Some argue that the sense of constant threat was exaggerated by Eastern writers and traveling showmen. Others point to letters, court records, and death certificates that paint a picture of daily ambient fear. Regardless of which view holds more weight, one thing is clear: settlers prepared for the worst, because they often saw it. You try to do the same. Every night you review your defenses: the rope on the coop, the position of the lantern, the number of rounds in the revolver, the sound of the wind. You count these things like others count sheep, except you're not trying to fall asleep. You're trying to stay alive until morning. Eventually the fire dies down and the room turns colder. You huddle deeper under your covers and watch your breath cloud in front of you. Your stomach growls, but you're too tired to stand. Besides, there's not much left to eat. Just a heel of bread and a few beans soaking in cold water. You'll deal with it tomorrow. If there is a tomorrow. You hear another howl, this one closer. The mule brays and the goat stands. You sit up, heart pounding. You reach for the revolver and listen. Nothing. Silence. Then the wind picks up again, masking all other sound. You lie back slowly, still holding the revolver. You place it on your chest and close your eyes. You don't expect to sleep deeply. No one does out here. But if you do sleep, it'll be with one ear open and one hand ready. Because on the frontier, night isn't a time of rest, it's a test. And if you're lucky, you'll wake up when the light returns. You don't wake up in your cabin this time. You wake up in a covered wagon rocking slightly on its creaking wooden wheels. The canvas overhead is already bleached by sun and dust, the seams flapping softly with each breath of morning wind. Outside, the prairie stretches in every direction, vast and unknowable. There are no neighbors, no fences, no familiar landmarks. Just the trail, a rutted, mud-scarred path ahead of you, and a fading set of wagon tracks behind. You're on the Oregon Trail now, and if you thought survival back on your homestead was a challenge, this is an entirely different kind of misery. Your throat is dry. You sit up slowly, careful not to hit your head on the curved supports of the wagon. The floor beneath you is cluttered with sacks of beans flour and jerky, your entire pantry. You slept on top of it last night, wrapped in a thin wool blanket. It didn't help much. Your back still aches from the wagon bed's stiff planks. As you swing your legs over the side and step out onto the dry ground, your boots kick up a puff of dust that coats your ankles in the familiar grit of the frontier. This morning's stop is brief. There's no time for luxury, no time to linger over fire or breakfast or stretching. The team leader, a grizzled man in a sweat-stained hat, calls out that you need to move. The team's behind schedule, and you're still hundreds of miles from anything resembling safety. You glance at the sun and sigh. Another day of walking. Another day of creaking wheels, hungry animals, blistered feet, and the terrible gnawing truth that at any point, someone in the wagon ahead of you might die, or someone in yours. The Oregon Trail stretched over 2,100 miles from Missouri to the Willamette Valley in Oregon Territory. Between the 1840s and 1860s, nearly 400,000 people attempted the journey. They came in search of land, gold, and freedom, but often found sickness, hunger, and death. It's estimated that 1 in 10 pioneers perished along the way, making the Oregon Trail one of the most dangerous and grueling mass migrations in American history. Disease, especially cholera, was the #1 killer. You've been walking for maybe an hour before you feel the heat creeping into your skin. The bonnet you tied beneath your chin offers little shade, and the prairie has no trees, just low, scrubby brush and occasional swarms of insects. You slap at a mosquito and keep walking. The wagon creaks ahead of you, its wheels bouncing over rocks and ruts. The oxen pull steadily, their heads low. You envy them a little. At least they don't think about death every day. At least they don't bury the people they love in shallow roadside graves. Speaking of graves, you pass one just before noon. A wooden cross barely standing, carved with a name and a year 1849. The grass has grown around it, but not over it. You glance away quickly. You've passed at least 24 like it since the journey began, and they don't get easier. You say nothing. No one does. They called the Oregon Trail the world's longest graveyard, and it wasn't an exaggeration. Some estimates suggest that one person died for every 80 yards of trail. That's nearly 30,000 people. Mothers, children, fathers, whole families sometimes. Most of them from disease. Cholera could sweep through a wagon train in hours. One moment, someone would be coughing. The next, they'd be vomiting, seizing, dying. There were no doctors, no hospitals. Just a decision: bury the body here or push forward and pretend they never existed. You stop for a quick rest near a stream, but you don't drink right away. The water looks clean, but you've learned not to trust appearances. The man 2 wagons back drank from a clear pool yesterday. He hasn't stood up since. You boil a small pot using twigs and brush to make a fire just hot enough. You drink, then splash a little over your face and neck. It evaporates instantly. The midday heat is brutal. Your clothes stick to your skin. Your shoulders ache from carrying the same sack day after day. Your boots, already worn when you left Missouri, have rubbed your heels raw. One toe bleeds through a split seam. You wrap it in a scrap of linen torn from a shirt. No one offers help. They're all nursing their own wounds. The children, though still healthy, walk beside the wagons, dragging sticks in the dirt or chasing shadows. They play games you don't have the energy to understand. You envy them and fear for them all at once. You've seen what happens when a child gets a fever out here. There are no miracles, just silence. You think about turning back sometimes. But then you remember what's behind you, debt drought, the memory of failure. The East had no room left for you. The West promised something more, at least. That's what the pamphlets said. Free land, fresh starts, a better life. They didn't mention dysentery, starvation, or burying your spouse with a kitchen spoon. You keep walking. By late afternoon, you pass a wagon wheel, shattered, splintered, half buried in the dirt. Someone's trail ended here. The wagon is gone, its bones left behind. You wonder if they made it to safety or if the trail claimed them like so many others. It's hard to say. No one keeps records out here. The only stories that last are the ones people whisper when the fire burns low. You finally stop again as the sun dips toward the horizon. Tonight's camp is on a slight rise drive for now, and away from the low ground where mosquitoes breed. You help set up the canvas again, tightening ropes, checking knots, inspecting the wheels. You check the oxen, rub their legs, make sure they're still sound. One is limping slightly. You pretend not to notice. There's no spare. Dinner is beans and hardtack. You soak the biscuit in warm water until it softens enough to bite. You chew slowly, your jaw aching. You haven't tasted salt in days. You trade everything you own for a handful of coffee or a spoonful of sugar. But there's nothing left to trade. After dinner, you sit near the fire. The wind whistles across the plains, and you pull your coat tighter. Around you, others murmur quietly. Someone strums a banjo. A woman hums a lullaby. It's almost peaceful if you forget where you are. If you forget how many people are missing from the group that started this journey. Historians confirm that the emotional toll of the Oregon Trail was as devastating as the physical. Letters from travelers often describe the psychological strain, the monotony, the fear, the grief. Some spoke of hallucinations. Some confessed to praying that they'd get sick, just so they could stop walking. A few survivors admitted that suicide wasn't uncommon. You lie down under the wagon wrapped in a blanket that does little to stop the cold seeping up from the ground. Your boots stay on, there's no use taking them off. You might not get them back on in the morning. You close your eyes, listening to the creak of canvas, the shuffle of animals, the distant howl of wolves. Scholars still debate whether the promise of the West justified the cost of getting there. Some believe the trail was a heroic chapter in the American story, a testament to grit and endurance. Others see it as a slow, desperate exodus, fueled by false promises and terrible decisions. Either way, no one denies the suffering. The numbers speak for themselves. The bones still lie along the trail. Sleep comes fitfully. You dream of water, of fruit, of soft beds and warm kitchens. You dream of home, but not the one you left behind, the one you're heading toward, the one that might not even exist. Morning comes again, cold, sharp, impatient. You stretch your legs, groan at the stiffness, and stand. Another day, another mile, another name to remember if someone doesn't wake up. And still you keep walking. You're back on firmer ground now, figuratively, if not always literally. The dust from the trail still clings to your boots, and the ache in your calves hasn't eased since your journey west began. But at least now there's a town, a post office, and even a smithy where the hammer-on-anvil rhythm feels like the heartbeat of civilization. You've found your footing in this new world. But as you glance around at the hats, the boots, the spurs, the rifles, it hits you again. Something's missing. Or rather, someone. You see the rugged silhouettes, the wide-brimmed hats and sun-darkened faces, the long coats flapping in the wind. These are the cowboys, the mythic figures carved into the spine of American legend. But as the years pass and the stories get told and retold, one truth becomes harder to find. Most of the cowboys we remember today look the same in the retelling's white heroic solitary. But that picture is incomplete. Deeply, deliberately incomplete. Here's what the trail rarely tells you. Nearly 1 in 4 cowboys in the American West was black. Add to that the thousands of Mexican vaqueros who laid the groundwork for American cattle ranching, and the many Native Americans and mixed-race laborers who worked the ranges, and the romantic image we hold up to the light starts to look more like a shadow puppet than history. The West wasn't just white. It never was. You're in a cattle town now. Maybe Abilene, maybe El Paso, maybe Dodge on a quiet day. Cows fill the dusty street like spilled marbles. You step between them, careful of their horns. A young cowboy rides past you at a canter. He's no older than 18, lean and sharp-eyed, his skin the color of burnished cedar. He nods at you politely. You nod back. He's likely working sunup to sundown for $30 a month and a place to sleep in the hayloft. He's probably the best roper in the territory, and no one outside this stretch of prairie will ever know his name. You keep walking past the saloon and into the stable, where men from 3 different backgrounds are eating from the same pot. One is humming in Spanish. Another rolls a cigarette with thick, calloused fingers. The third, older, quieter, leans back with his hat tipped low. His skin is deep brown, his eyes sharp as nails. No one says much. There's work in the morning. And like most cowboys, they don't need words to understand each other. Cowboys were laborers, often poor, often marginalized, almost always overlooked in their own time. The Hollywood image that came later, the stoic noble loner in spotless boots and a crisp white hat, was a creation, not a reflection. A filtered memory made for stage shows and silent films. The real cowboys were messy, diverse, and far more complicated than legend allows. Mainstream historical records confirm that following the Civil War, thousands of formerly enslaved black men moved west in search of work and freedom. Many found both on the open range. They became skilled cattle hands, horse breakers, trail guides. They were respected by many of their peers, even if broader society continued to deny them rights. Figures like Nat Love, known as Deadwood Dick, left behind autobiographies detailing life on the trail, the danger, the humor, the exhaustion. He wasn't alone. Black cowboys made up as much as 25% of the labor force in certain regions, especially in Texas and Oklahoma. And yet, as you wander this little town, it's clear that their stories didn't make it to the posters nailed to the general store walls. The dime novels you find on the counter, illustrated tales of adventure and justice, don't mention them. The heroes in those pages all have the same face, the same voice. And it isn't the one you heard back at the stable. You stop at the blacksmith's to ask about work. He shrugs and points toward the stockyard. They always need hands, he mutters. But they don't take just anyone. You know what he means. Not about skill, about color. You thank him anyway and leave. You follow the sound of hooves and shouting, and find the roundup in full swing. Dust billows into the sky, lit gold by the late afternoon sun. Cowboys ride hard looping ropes through the air, chasing calves, with precision honed by necessity. You recognize the young rider from earlier. He's fast, confident, fluid. He ropes a steer in seconds, flat, his movements smooth and practiced. No one cheers. No one claps. It's just work. Invisible work. Necessary work. You sit on the fence and watch. A man beside you lights a pipe and glances sideways. That boy, he says, jerking his chin toward the rider. Could teach half these fellas a thing or two. Shame the boss won't pay him what he's worth. You nod. It's a shame, but not a surprise. Many Mexican and Tejano cowboys, vaqueros, were among the most skilled riders and livestock handlers in the West. Their techniques, including roping, branding, and cattle driving, shaped what became the American cowboy tradition. Even the word rodeo comes from the Spanish rodear, meaning to surround. But as Anglo settlers took control of lands and ranches, many vaqueros were pushed into low-paid labor or excluded altogether. Their names were forgotten, their contributions minimized. And then there were native cowboys, Lakota, Apache, Navajo, who adapted their skills to the new cattle economy. Some rode for wages, others for survival. Some fought for land. Others tried to adapt in the hope that cooperation would spare their families. Most were disappointed. Scholars still debate how and why the myth of the all-white cowboy took roots so strongly in American culture. Some say it was the result of 20th century nationalism, creating a symbol of rugged individualism for a rapidly modernizing country. Others point to entertainment. Wild West shows early Western films and pulp novels that prioritized simplicity over accuracy. Whatever the reason, the result was erasure. You see it everywhere now that you know to look. In the town's photographs, in the saloon's paintings, in the stories whispered over whiskey. The West is being remembered while it's still being lived, and misremembered at that. You step down from the fence and walk past the bunkhouse. You can hear laughter inside the clink of tin mugs and the scrape of boots against floorboards. Someone's playing a tune on a harmonica. You think about how many voices have gone unheard in places like this. How many names never made it onto plaques or statues or school books. Not because they didn't matter, but because they didn't fit the narrative someone else decided was worth telling. You think of Bill Pickett, a black cowboy who invented the technique of bulldogging wrestling steers by biting their upper lips. He performed across the country in rodeos, but was often billed as Native American or Mexican in posters, because audiences wouldn't accept a black cowboy as a headline act. You think of Esom Dart, a former slave turned rancher and horseman, shot in the back by a hired killer with ties to local cattle barons. You think of the unnamed vaqueros who taught cattle skills to the very men who would one day take their lands and their credit. And you wonder how many others never even got that much. You walk back toward your camp, your boots scuffing against dry earth. The sun is low now, and the sky has turned the color of rust and fire. You pass the young cowboy again. He nods to you. You nod back. That's all. Nothing needs to be said. In the distance, the cattle bawl and shuffle. A dog barks twice. Somewhere a bell rings to call men to dinner. You sit by your fire that night and stare into the embers. You think about stories, who tells them, who gets written into them, who gets left out. And you remember something an old man once said back east: history belongs to those who print it. You never understood that until now. Because the cowboys who rode hardest, who worked longest, who knew the land best, many of them weren't printed at all, but they were here, every day, every trail, every roundup. They shaped the West in sweat and silence. And even if their names didn't make it onto the pages, they were never forgotten by the wind. The morning air is still heavy with the smell of dust and coffee boiled too long. You sit on the stoop watching the sun claw its way above the edge of the horizon, and your eyes rest for a moment on the figure moving through the pasture. She's already been up for hours, feeding chickens, hauling water, mending yesterday's torn apron, and now she's leading a skittish calf back to the corral with nothing more than a wooden spoon and a voice low enough to calm thunder. You sip your coffee and try not to feel guilty. But you do, because no matter how hard you've worked, no matter how much you ache or bleed or swear into the wind, it's likely still less than what she's carried quietly, invisibly, every day you've known her. This is the Wild West, but it isn't just men who carved it out of dust and sweat. Women did too. They just weren't the ones who got their faces on the posters. You head back inside and find her already at the stove stirring cornmeal into a cast iron pot, with the kind of practiced rhythm that tells you she could do it blindfolded. The baby is tied to her back in a faded muslin wrap. There's a toddler on the floor near her feet, chewing on a spoon, and the older boy is outside chopping kindling, because she told him it builds backbone. You don't argue. You just set the table and hope the coffee kicks in before the goats break out again. The idea that frontier women were passive, delicate, or ornamental is a fantasy, one more artifact from dime novels and Eastern imaginations. Out here, women were everything: nurse, teacher, seamstress, butcher, fence builder, field hand, childbearer, widow, gravedigger, sometimes all in the same week. They weren't helpmates, they were survival. Mainstream historical records and census data from the late 19th century show that in many frontier communities, especially in the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain territories, women often outnumbered men in terms of labor output within the home. Not because men didn't work, but because the domestic sphere on the frontier wasn't limited to dishes and laundry. It included everything inside and around a homestead animal: care, food production, healing, spiritual leadership, and education. When husbands died, as many did young widows carried on running farms, raising children and keeping communities afloat. You remember the neighbor down the trail, a woman who buried 2 husbands before she turned 30. One died in a mine collapse, the other from typhoid. She has 4 kids and runs a store out of her kitchen. She milks 6 cows every morning and still finds time to patch other people's clothes. Last fall, when a ranch hand showed up drunk and tried to break her window, she ran him off with a shovel and a warning shot. No one's bothered her since. And she's not an exception. She's the rule. You finish breakfast, put on your boots, and help load the wagon with feed and tools. She climbs up beside you, tucking a rifle into the straps of her skirt like it's just another pocket, which to her it is. You head toward the next town, 4 hours by wagon, to sell eggs and butter. The baby sleeps at her feet. She hums a hymn, one you don't recognize. The road is rough, but her posture is straight, her hands steady on the reins. Later at the mercantile, she negotiates prices with the shopkeeper, an older man who calls her ma'am with just enough respect to avoid insult. She gets the price she wants. She always does. In 1869, the Wyoming Territory became the first U.S. jurisdiction to grant women the right to vote, a radical move for its time. Some historians argue it was a symbolic gesture to attract settlers, but the result was real empowerment. Western women weren't waiting for permission. They were already running businesses, filing land claims and raising children alone in conditions that would have broken many of their eastern counterparts. After the errands, you sit outside on the steps of the post office, the sun warming your face. She's inside sending a letter to her sister back east, asking for news maybe or a spool of better thread. You know the letter won't arrive for weeks. Still, she writes one every month, carving order out of the chaos. A woman walks past with 2 baskets of apples, her hands blistered from the harvest. Another carries a sack of flour on her shoulder, her skirts dusty and her hair tucked under a wide hat. They nod to each other. You see no sign of fragility in any of them, only the kind of grit that doesn't ask for applause. Historians still argue over whether women on the frontier found more freedom or just more work. Some suggest that the West by necessity flattened social hierarchies. If you could build a barn or save a child from a rattlesnake bite, no one cared about your corset. Others point to how frontier women still had little legal autonomy, particularly if married. They couldn't easily own property sue in court or control their earnings. The reality lies somewhere between liberation and exploitation. Women had space to move, but often at enormous personal cost. You ride home as the sun begins to fall behind the hills, its light casting long shadows on the road. She leans back in the wagon seat, one hand on her child's back, the other still wrapped in a leather glove that's missing 2 fingers. She lost them to frostbite last winter. Didn't complain, just bandaged the wound and kept on cooking. At home, there's still milking to be done, chickens to shut in, supper to make. You offer to help. She nods, smiling but tired. Her eyes are always tired now. Later, after the kids are asleep, you sit by the stove in silence. She mends a shirt, her needle darting through the fabric, like it has somewhere to be. You try not to yawn, but she notices. "Go on," she says softly. "I'll be along." You leave her there working into the night, same as always. Out on the plains, silence stretches. Coyotes howl in the distance. The wind shifts. And somewhere behind you a woman, your wife, your mother, your neighbor, your friend, keeps the West from falling apart. One stitch at a time. Acknowledged. Continuing now with section 12 of your script, targeting 2,700 words as requested. You wake early again. Not because the rooster crowed, but because the cold seeped into your bones overnight. The fire went out hours ago, and the draft through the log wall is slicing through your wool blanket like it's gauze. You sit up slowly, cracking your back like an old porch step, and shuffle to the stove. But there's no wood left inside. You'll have to chop some before breakfast. Outside, the frost crunches under your boots. You glance up at the ridge where the next homestead lies barely visible in the mist. You remember who lives there, the Chins. Mrs. Chin runs a boarding house for single miners. Mr. Chin grows vegetables so precise and straight, they almost look fake. Their son is the best shot in the valley, quieter than most, but quicker than all. People call him Tommy, even though his name is Wai Chun. You don't see them much, not because you don't want to, but because you've noticed how others look at them in town. This is the part of the West no one told you about. Not the cattle rustlers or the saloon brawls, not the stagecoaches or the outlaws, but the people whose stories got buried. People who built the West to one rail spike, one plot of land, one chop of firewood at a time, but were written out of it. You throw a few logs into the stove and spark the flame to life. The smell of smoke fills the room, and you feel the warmth return slowly to your fingertips. You're thinking about what it takes to belong in a place like this, and who gets remembered when the stories get written. Because the forgotten West is full of names that never made it into the legends. Black cowboys, Chinese laborers, Mexican vaqueros, indigenous guides, mixed-race families, Japanese farmers, Filipino fishermen. They were there, right there in the dust and danger with everyone else. But when the novels got written and the dime store covers printed, they were invisible, or worse, villains. Let's start with the Chinese immigrants. They were central to building the Transcontinental Railroad, especially the western half. Between 1865 and 1869, more than 10,000 Chinese laborers worked in brutal conditions to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountains. They were paid less than white workers, given the most dangerous jobs and segregated into camps. Yet without their labor, the railroad that united America wouldn't exist. Mainstream historical records confirm this, though many early textbooks glossed over the contribution entirely. Chinese workers built tunnels by hand, used black powder to blast granite cliffs, and carried supplies on foot up mountain switchbacks in winter. In one winter alone, hundreds froze to death in avalanches or starved in remote camps cut off by snow. And when the Golden Spike was hammered into place in Utah in 1869, not one Chinese worker was invited to stand in the photo. Meanwhile, black Americans moved west, seeking new freedom after the Civil War. Many were formerly enslaved. Others were born free and chased opportunity across the Mississippi. Some became soldiers in the Buffalo regiments, stationed at remote forts and tasked with fighting native tribes, an assignment both complicated and bitterly ironic. Others became homesteaders, farmers, and town builders. In places like Nicodemus, Kansas, and Boley, Oklahoma, black communities flourished with their own schools, banks, and governments. But these towns were often under-resourced, denied railroad connections, and targeted by hostile neighbors. Violence was not uncommon. Still, the people stayed because here at least they had land, a chance, a shot at dignity. The story of Mexican and Tejano settlers is another thread erased or twisted. Long before the American frontier pushed west, these communities had already developed thriving ranching cultures. Many of the tools, techniques, and terms now associated with cowboys actually originated with Mexican vaqueros, chaps from chaparreras, lazos, la riata, rodeos, rodeo meaning roundup. Yet after the Mexican-American War, thousands of Mexican landowners saw their property seized or swindled through legal manipulations. Some fought back in court. Others formed resistance bands. Most were simply pushed to the margins both economically and historically. And then there were Native Americans not just as obstacles to settler progress, but as partners, guides, translators, and in some cases family. Intermarriage between settlers and native people was more common than the myths suggest, especially in remote areas where survival depended on mutual respect and knowledge sharing. Some children from these unions went on to lead both indigenous and settler communities. Historians still argue whether these multicultural communities ever had a real shot at equality, or whether the structures of settler colonialism made that impossible from the beginning. What's clear is that diversity on the frontier wasn't a modern concept. It was a historical fact, even if the storybook versions later erased it. You pull on your boots and head down the trail toward the Chin homestead. You promise to help mend a fence this week. Mr. Chin waves as you arrive, his face weathered but smiling. The children are chasing chickens across the yard. Inside, Mrs. Chin offers tea. It smells like ginger and pine needles. You work in silence for a while, driving nails into the fence posts and knotting rope through wooden slats. The air smells like cedar and ash. Eventually, Mr. Chin tells you he's been saving to build a greenhouse. He wants to grow something that lasts past the frost. His voice cracks a little when he talks about what they left behind to come here. The village. His brother. His real name. You nod. You understand more than you say. Afterward, you help haul firewood into the kitchen. There's a calendar on the wall written in Chinese characters. You can't read it, but it looks like it means something sacred. The room is warm, the baby sleeping in a basket lined with lamb's wool. It feels like home. As you leave, Mrs. Chin presses a cloth-wrapped bundle into your hand. Steamed buns. You protest, but she insists. You work, she says simply. You eat. Walking home, the steam warms your fingers through the cloth, and something else warms your chest. Later, you pass the schoolhouse where a black teacher named Mr. Davis holds class for children of all colors. His chalkboard is cracked. His roof leaks. But he teaches anyway. History, reading, how to stand tall even when others tell you to shrink. You stop for a moment outside the window. The kids are reciting a poem in unison. Something about wide skies and wider hearts. This is the West, too. The one no one told you about. The one with rice fields and gospel hymns and jarapeo and wedding quilts, made of scrap silk and feed sacks. The one with pride that doesn't need permission. You make it home as dusk spills down the valley. The fire is still going. Your partner is sewing by the hearth. The baby is babbling nonsense. You sit, unwrap your gift, and bite into something soft, spicy, and new. The flavor reminds you that history has more spices than we let on. The next time someone asks you about the Old West, the real West, you'll think of this. Not the guns or the sheriffs or the duels at dawn, but the faces no one drew, the names that got scrubbed from the plaques, the families who spoke more than one language, and still called this dust and bone land home. You'll remember that the West wasn't just wild. It was wide. Wide enough to hold sorrow and songs in 10 dialects. Wide enough for wheat and rice and collards and cactus. Wide enough for all of them if only the stories had been. But they weren't. And still the people lived. And still they built. And still they endure. You haven't eaten since the sun was high. And now, with dusk settling in like a wool blanket across the plains, your stomach growls louder than the coyotes. You wander toward the small cast-iron stove, one of the few luxuries in your modest homestead, and open the lid. There's only enough fuel for one more meal tonight, maybe 2 if you keep the fire small and low. You reach for the tin of beans and the slab of salted pork, hanging from a rope in the corner. As you begin preparing your humble dinner, it hits you this isn't just a bad day. This is dinner on the frontier. The menu isn't changing anytime soon. The romantic idea of cowboy cooking might include sizzling steaks and pots of strong coffee on the open range, but the reality was as bleak as the soil. Most frontier families subsisted on the same ingredients, day in and day out: beans, bacon, biscuits if you were lucky. Fresh vegetables were seasonal luxuries, and fruit was a distant dream unless you lived near a wild orchard, or had the rare chance to preserve summer's bounty. And even then, sugar was so expensive, it was practically a precious metal. Tonight's meal, like so many others, will be a mix of practicality and compromise. Beans slowly simmered in a dented kettle, their earthy aroma masking the blandness of the dish. Pork fat for flavor if you have any left. Bread made from coarse hand-ground cornmeal, dry and crumbling. And if it's really been a bad week, something far more unsettling: boiled leather lizard stew, or even snake. Yes, snake. Rattlesnake if you're precise about it. Plenty of old-timers swore it tasted just like chicken. That's probably wishful thinking, but on the frontier, you don't have time for culinary critique. If it moves slower than you and won't kill you, it's food. Here's the official historical fact for the night, according to detailed records from multiple frontier diaries and ration logs. Most settlers, particularly during harsh winters or isolated stretches, got over 60% of their calories from preserved pork and beans. It wasn't gourmet, but it kept you alive. Barely. And while beans might be a punchline now on the prairie, they were precious. They were cheap, didn't spoil easily, and could be soaked overnight even in cold water. Plus, the flatulence they caused was a small price to pay for the slow, long-lasting energy they gave, a fact cowboys joked about but deeply appreciated. Salt pork was the other half of the survival equation. It wasn't bacon the way modern folks think of it, but thick, fatty meat packed in barrels of brine. It could last for months, years, even if properly stored. The taste intense, salty enough to curl your toes. Some folks soaked it for hours to make it edible. Others just fried it and chased it with strong black coffee to mask the aftertaste. Scholars still debate whether the monotony of frontier meals contributed to long-term health problems, or simply built a tolerance to simplicity. Some point to conditions like scurvy common during long winters, without fresh produce, as evidence that nutrition wasn't just lacking, it was dangerous. Others argue that while the meals were repetitive, they were adequate enough for people doing physically punishing labor every day. What about water, you ask? That depended on your luck. Clean wells were rare in dry regions, and rivers weren't always nearby or safe. Boiling water helped, but that required fuel, which was also limited. In prairie regions without trees, many relied on buffalo chips, dried bison dung for cooking. It didn't smell great, but it burned hot and clean. If you lived in the desert southwest, you might use mesquite. In forested areas, you used wood, but that still took hours to gather, chop, and haul. One quirky tidbit that always surprises people: coffee was a luxury, but it was one of the most fiercely protected items in any frontier pantry. Even if you ran out of everything else, a stash of beans, green or roasted, was like a sacred ritual. Settlers ground it by hand, boiled it in black kettles, and drank it even when the grounds had been reused 3 times. Some even roasted dandelion roots as a substitute when coffee ran out. It wasn't quite the same, but it was warm, bitter, and kept you moving. You sit down to your meager meal by candlelight. The beans are hot at least. The cornbread is gritty but filling. And as for dessert, maybe a bit of molasses on a biscuit if you still have any. Or a dried apple ring soaked in hot water to soften it. You choose slowly, not for pleasure, but because you want the moment to last. You know there's nothing more in the larder. Not until you trade with the peddler next week or butcher one of your chickens. And that's only if the foxes haven't gotten them first. Back in town, food wasn't much better. Saloons offered meals if you could afford them. A plate of fricasseed rabbit might just be yesterday's stew reheated with a splash of whiskey. Hotel kitchens tried harder, but unless you were in a booming mining town with access to railroads, fresh ingredients were rare. Canned goods were becoming more common by the 1870s, but they were expensive and prone to spoilage if the tin seals failed. Besides, most tins had no labels, so opening one was always a gamble. One infamous case recorded in the 1873 Denver Tribune detailed a mining crew in Leadville who opened a tin of peaches, only to find spoiled oysters. No one ate dinner that night. One man swore off canned food for life. The cook laughed, called them spoiled Easterners, and ate the oysters himself. That's frontier life for you. Everything's a risk, including the food. You scrape the last of the beans from the pan and clean up with a rag soaked in lukewarm water. There's no sink, no soap unless you made your own, just ashes grit and elbow grease. If you're lucky, you'll get the dishes done before the rats come looking for leftovers. You hang the rag to dry bank the fire and sit back with a full, if unsatisfied, belly. Outside, the sky is darkening to ink. Stars flicker above you, far brighter than anything you'll ever see in a city. The air smells of wood smoke, grease, and earth. It's quiet. You can almost forget how hard the day has been. Almost. You think of your neighbors again, how they manage to stretch meals even further. The Johnsons pickle wild onions in vinegar. The Yamamotos ferment cabbage into something spicy and sharp. The Rodriguezes grow chiles so hot they make your eyes water from 10 paces. Everyone's found a way to make the monotony edible. And that's what it really is, survival by creativity. There's no frontier cookbook that truly captures this part of history. It wasn't about recipes. It was about making do. A skillet and a spoon were your weapons. The fire was your ally and sometimes your enemy. Too hot and you burned your rations. Too low and you ate cold beans again. You remember hearing someone joke that frontier folks had 3 meals, hot, hotter, and burned? They weren't wrong. The children go to bed hungry sometimes. That's the truth people don't like to remember. You ration food carefully, trying to make it stretch. You dream of peach cobbler and roasted chicken, but you wake to dry bread and salt. And yet you survive, day by day. Historians still argue whether frontier hunger was a sign of poor planning or just the unavoidable reality of distance and hardship. Some say settlers should have known better than to build in such remote areas. Others argue that government land grants promised too much and delivered too little support. What is certain is that hunger shaped more than just stomachs. It shaped attitudes. It taught thrift toughness and sometimes cruelty. You remember old Mr. Keegan, who once shot a trespasser for stealing a chicken. The man was starving. So was his family. But so was Keegan's. No charges were filed. The judge called it self-defense. The preacher called it God's will. And everyone moved on like it never happened. But it did. And tonight, as you settle into bed with a belly full of boiled beans and memories, you know that the West wasn't just wild because of guns and gold. It was wild because of hunger, constant, gnawing, unforgiving. You blow out the candle and listen to the silence. A coyote yips in the distance. Your stomach grumbles again, not out of hunger, but habit. You've trained it to be grateful. Because out here, what's for dinner isn't a question. It's a dare. You wake in the pre-dawn gloom, not to the comfort of a screened alarm clock, but to a wet ache in your jaw and the persistent stench of last night's cooking fire. Your ribs feel sore as if someone pressed their knee into your side while you slept. It's the kind of pain that doesn't require remembering you know it. It's part of living here. But today, something else pulls at your thoughts. The ache in your leg, dull and deep from a corner you've been nursing for days. You weren't paying attention while chopping wood, and now the wound aches with every step. A glance at your reflection in the cracked window shows eyes still sharp, but that one hand falters when you lift your shirt to inspect the cut. Red fingers press gently. Skin puffs and leaks infected swollen. Infection is a word that chills you, because out here infection often leads to something far darker. Sooner or later, when something goes wrong, you come to realize how you never actually heal. You just stop bleeding, or your body stops caring. Medicine on the frontier is a combination of guesswork, folklore, and the occasional miracle. Doctors, where they exist at all, are usually unlicensed, self-taught, or only lightly trained. Many learned their craft from reading cadavers in Eastern schools, or by watching their own. There's no sanitation, no antibiotics, no guarantee whatsoever that a doctor's visit will help more than hurt. Several journals from the 1870s recount pioneer women and men doubling as midwives, field surgeons, and herbalists. These individuals used homemade salves from poulticed roots, cauterized wounds with boiling oil, or even heated irons. These treatments could stem bleeding, but often came at unbearable pain. Forget Novocaine. Fainting was often the mercy sought with whiskey rationed for courage rather than taste. Today you have neither whiskey nor opiate laudanum. You have a basin of weak tea and a handful of painful determination. You heat the kettle over the dwindling embers, not risking splinters from your wooden spoon, and gently clean the wound. A rag cleanish from boiling is pressed against swollen flesh as you whisper encouragement. Around you the house creaks. Outside a dog barks, and you wonder whether one bark means a neighbor passing, or a coyote at the door. You've heard stories from a real frontier doctor who arrived at a remote railroad camp in 1874 with a diploma only to have miners laugh at him after he tried to sterilize his surgical instruments with pure alcohol. They spat whiskey on their hands first. But worse than unsterilized tools were the tools themselves: bone saws, amputation knives, broken scalpels. One diary reads, "I would rather face Indians on the plains than face old Dr. Clancy at my side." You're not facing Clancy today, but you are staring at your bone. The cut's deep recession, deep enough to suggest that unless you do something, your leg may still be lost to infection. You consider the only available option. Make it shallow, promote drainage, or risk chasing this wound to your grave. With trembling fingers, you reach for the only metal tool left, a pair of blunt nail scissors with rust around the hinge. Historians have documented use of house call instruments, from farming kits or dressmaking sets, when professional tools weren't available. These improvised surgeries rarely ended well, but they did prevent worse outcomes, or so survivors insisted. You clamp the scissors around the swollen flesh and press. Blood seeps out too slowly. You breathe. You coax until fluid runs clear instead of clouded. The pain is immediate crushing. You bite down on a scrap of cloth and shout low into your sleeve. Time stops between the beats of your heart, broken only by the rasping wheeze of the stove, and the distant moan of wind across broken shutters. Afterward, you wrap the wound in a linen strip, soaked in your own boiled tea. It's antiseptic enough, or as antiseptic as frontier life allows. Blood seeps into the rag and your fingers tremble, not only from pain, but from the knowledge that you've just chosen life over sedation. You rest your hand on the table, where an empty tin once used to store tobacco lies beneath your shaking grip. Pain recedes into numbness, and the room tilts like a ship caught in a storm. You hold onto the table, forcing your breath steady. No more whiskey, no more cotton, just clean cloth and deliberate breaths. Minutes or hours later, you lose track. The pain dulls enough for you to lie down again, but not enough to sleep. Sleep is reserved for those who feel safe. Many frontier homes kept informal medicine chests, usually a wooden box, with a few herbs, liquor bandages, cotton thread, and a manual bound in leather or cloth. People treated snake bites with tourniquets and cowbells hung around livestock necks. They burned feathers in oil to remove thorns. But when real emergencies came, they relied either on bare hands, bitter luck, or faith. Compounding misfortune, childbirth remains the deadliest risk of all. Maternal mortality rates on the frontier hovered around 1 in 100 times higher than today's U.S. average. That wasn't a statistic. It was every whispered prayer across every midnight labor. Many women never made it through their first birth. Their husbands never held them again. Children grew up catching glimpses of grief through twig fences and soot-stained windows. You dozed in and out of consciousness, the rag around your leg growing stiff with drying blood. When you wake fully, the sun is high in the sky. It's afternoon. You're in pain but alive. The wound throbs steadily a drumbeat to remind you that living here is not the absence of suffering, but the persistence through it. A knock rattles your door, tentative and familiar. You grip the edge of your bed and sit up. Your neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, stands there steely-faced but smiling, a rag in her hand, dirt under her nails. In her apron pocket, a small jar of lye soap, a cloth bandage, and a thread spool. She doesn't ask what happened. She pauses, sets her bag down, kneels beside you, and unwraps the tea cloth. You let her. She washes the wound, gently stops when her eyes meet yours. Understanding. You nod. She applies a fresh poultice made from willow bark and honey, natural antiseptic and pain reliever according to tradition. You swallow your pride. Evening comes. She's still there, cleaning your wound again, tucking covers around your legs. You watch her hands. Strong, compassionate, careful. 2/3 of frontier wives and mothers delivered that kind of care each day. Nursing injury or illness that might have been life-ending if left unattended. When she stands, she dresses in gray twilight and heads home. She waits outside, hands folded until you sit upright. Then she nods. You're not back to work yet. Not today. But in frontier life, rest isn't optional. It's compulsory when the price of movement is death. Tomorrow you'll get back on your feet, literally. But for now, you stare at the fading light and let the ache remind you this land doesn't give second chances easily. Only scars. At least yours came with care. The next morning arrives with that same damp ache in your bones, but you find motion easier than yesterday. The wound's throbbing seems steadier, less urgent. When you ease the cloth away, the raw pink flesh is no longer oozing, just tender. A scab is forming. Still, infection is a constant, silent threat. You rise slowly, limbs creaking as if they've forgotten how to function. You reach for the basin and warm water cold by city standards, nearly scalding for your reality. You clean the scab gently. Your neighbor's poultice slowed the bleeding and the pain, But time, they say, heals or resists healing. Out here, it often resists. The day's tasks are lighter barn chores instead of chopping logs, checking eggs instead of repairing fences. You hobble through them, grimacing with each step. People notice. You're not alone. Community matters here as much as grit. Several neighbors drop by Tom the blacksmith with a cloth and supply of whiskey liniment, Mrs. Perez with a stew of beans and nopals to give you strength. Old Mr. Keegan with a solemn nod, unspoken solidarity pass between men here. Mind meets body in frontier life, and the mind knows too well what the body hides. Anxiety is common. Worry about infection, feeding your kin, burying another neighbor. Sleepless nights start long before pain becomes obvious. People here aren't afraid of rattlesnakes or rustlers. They're afraid of madness, helplessness, the slow creep of despair. After chores, you sit on the porch with the blacksmith, his arm casually slung over your shoulder. The liniment stings but opens blood vessels. This'll help, he says, lighting a cigar. His father lost a leg to infection. Not a doctor, not a blessing, just a fight. You watch him puff in silence. He tells you about tools, the difference between a clean cut and ragged tear. History holds up accounts of frontier amputations done without anesthesia, bone saw endurance. Some miners chained bodies to wagons, dragging them until the limb froze off. It was practical and painfully efficient. You shudder. But what about pain-free frontier medicine? There wasn't any. Quinine helped with fevers and malaria in swampy regions. Calomel, a mercury compound, was used to purge illness, but often made things worse. Some settlers used laudanum and opium tincture to dull pain. It helped, also addicted, also a crutch disguised as cure. By 1880s, misuse had started cropping up in letters. I took a dram to ease the ache. Forgot when to stop. You sip weak coffee, the burnt edge of beans floating in stale water, and think of your options. Continue healing. Naturally risk sepsis, rely on neighbors, or load the wound with opioid tincture and hope tomorrow is better. You choose patience. The sun climbs. You lean against the porch post and close your eyes. The wind rattles the tin roof. The blacksmith shows you how to rewrap the leg cotton rag first, then a clean strip. Hands steady. You ask him questions like a late student. He answers. You learn. Frontier medicine wasn't limited to flesh. It was cramming knowledge on the fly. From salves to tourniquets to herbal teas. Women used willow bark salicin for pain. Juniper and spruce needles made teas for scurvy prevention. Alfalfa leaves for urinary issues. Mustard plasters for chest congestion. Yet this knowledge was unregulated. No certifications, no guarantees. Some poultices healed. Some brought poison. Some did both. Some killed you. So did nothing do you. Still, people persevered. Survivors learned from mistakes, wrote them in journals, so neighbors could avoid the same fate. Knowledge diffused slowly, quietly, house to house, well to well, until it became common sense worth more than gold. But ask yourself how many never learned. How many names were never written down? At midday, a cloudburst blows through, drenching the farm. You collect buckets of rainwater, liquid gold. It'll be used for cooking, laundry, maybe even medicine. Water for wounds is always cleaner than prairie spring water. But whose rain safe are you anyway? As rain patters, you notice the scab on your legs starting to soften. Good cleansing wash, but soak too long and scabs dissolve into ghastly wounds. You blot it gently, then wrap again tighter now, starting to feel more secure. A local traveling doctor, rare here, arrives when the storm lets up and knocks at the door. He's young, educated in a traveling college in Illinois. He carries a leather satchel with labeled jars. He smells of antiseptic carbolic acid, a rarity. Even so, he explains his training sterilized with boiling water bandage with gauze. He inspects your wound, frowns. Historical records show that by 1880, the medical community began adopting germ theory, but rural areas lagged far behind cities. Most frontier doctors still doubted germ theory, believing bad air caused illness. This man is a handful of exceptions practicing modern hygiene, washing hands, boiling bandages. He irritates local sociology, too proper, too expensive. But he offers you a tincture of iodine and advises a fresh bandage every day. You accept. You pay him with a chicken and a canvas bag of cornmeal, not much. He nods and departs when you insist. He seems surprised but respectful. Frontier medicine, like frontier justice, was inconsistent. Some pioneers depended on self-medication and neighborly care. Others paid for modern skill. But even progress arrives slowly here, seed by seed, dollar by wagon. The afternoon sun fades, soaked into muddy puddles that glint in twilight light. You sit by the window watching raindrops on the glass. The storm has washed some dust, revealed stars. Scattered, half-hidden, but there. Grace in chaos. You think of your wound healing not quickly, but hopefully. You think of Mrs. Johnson and the blacksmith and that traveling doctor. Hope building not like a castle, but like a hut. Historians debate whether frontier communities systematically adopted modern medicine, or whether folk remedies persisted until the 20th century. While some claim vaccines and hygiene spread by rail, others say traditional methods held sway into the 1900s. The truth again lies between, like your slow healing scar. You realize healing isn't just what crosses your skin. It's what crosses trust the doctor, accepting chicken neighbors offering advice your body resisting. Night arrives. You crawl into bed, wrapping clean linen around your leg. The ache hasn't disappeared, but it's softer. You count your blessings quietly. Not the riches, but the people who carried you here. There was a time when frontier survival meant dying alone. Now it might mean surviving together. Tomorrow you'll step forward again, legs stiff, but gaining strength, carrying knowledge, and maybe a bit more humility. Because frontier medicine, and by extension frontier life, was never just about flesh. It was about community and courage. You've made it this far, not without bruises, not without sacrifice, but still breathing. Still waking up each morning to that aching body and relentless prairie wind, to the scratch of burlap shirts and the creak of split wood floors. You're starting to realize that survival in the Wild West isn't marked by big cinematic victories. It's in the little decisions, the ones no one would ever film or write songs about. Like learning which part of a steer burns best. Like keeping the fire low to save wood. Like remembering which neighbor saved your leg with a paste of boiled pine bark and boiled water. Or which one didn't survive because he didn't ask. Tonight the wind sings low across the plains. You feel it in your teeth, like the sound of time stretching. The story you've lived is not just yours. It belongs to thousands, those who stayed, those who wandered, those who died within weeks of their first hopeful arrival. It's a story of work, more than wonder pain, more than pride. But still it is yours now. Dinner tonight is more of the same beans cooked with a few chunks of salt pork, a slice of dry cornbread, and a spoonful of canned peaches someone brought from back east months ago. You sit with it slowly, letting the flavors speak of distance. No one here eats quickly. No one wastes. Outside coyotes cry in the near distance. You learn to tell the difference between their casual barks and their warning howls. Something died out there. Something always is. A possum, maybe. Or a chicken someone forgot to latch away. You check your latch anyway. Safety is never assumed. You sip water and remember you hauled that from the creek 2 days ago. You boiled it for over an hour. You counted the bubbles. That's what survival looks like. Not heroism, just calculation. Mainstream historical fact. By 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau officially declared the American frontier closed. The line of settlement had reached the Pacific, and no longer could one reasonably say there was a continuous frontier. It marked the end of an era, but not its mythology. The stories told afterward through Wild West, shows, pulp novels, early cinema, spoke of duels at dawn of lone cowboys besting outlaws, of wise sheriffs and helpless townsfolk, and yes, of taming the land. But what they often left out were the fleas, the mold, the mothers buried beside stillborn children, the settlers who died of diarrhea before their names reached any record. The myth chose glory. The truth offered no such comfort, but it did offer understanding and responsibility. Quirky historical tidbit. Some early photographers staged frontier scenes with actors who had never been west of St. Louis. They used props, fake rifles, painted canvas backdrops to sell images of conquest and courage to audiences who'd never see the prairie. These photos became the West's truth to the world. Now you understand what the myth never showed. The West wasn't conquered. It was survived. At a cost. The ground under your feet is littered with bones, both human and animal. Prairie dogs reclaim fields. Settlers once tried to fence. Wild horses still run in places no fence could hold. And the wind still tells stories sometimes yours. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the American West was a place of opportunity or exploitation. Some point to the homesteading acts and chances for land ownership. Others cite the displacement of native peoples, ecological devastation, and racial exclusion as its true legacy. Perhaps the real answer lies in admitting both. That opportunity was carved from violence. That ambition walked with oppression. You lie down now for what may be the first true rest in weeks. The scab on your leg has hardened. Your eyes flicker closed, not from pain, but from peace. Just for tonight, you made it through a day in the Wild West. Not because you shot straighter, but because you listened, adapted, endured. That's how the real legends did it. And now as the wind fades and the last coals in the hearth whisper into ash, your body begins to settle into sleep. The journey you've taken tonight may have been one of history, but it was also one of empathy. You've walked a mile in the cracked boots of those who came before you, felt the scrape of hunger, the chill of wind through a poorly mortared wall, the pulse of fear under a bruise. The Wild West was never a place of easy answers or smooth paths. It was a place that tested the limits of endurance, where faith was often placed in fallible hands, and where survival required not just toughness, but community improvisation and luck. And yet, amid all this, there was beauty. Not the glossy kind found in postcards, but the beauty of resilience, of families gathered around pot-bellied stoves, of midwives bringing life into timber shacks, of settlers planting seeds in unforgiving soil, and daring to dream about a better season next year. So let that be your final thought as you drift, that even in a world as harsh as the Wild West, people found meaning. They laughed, they danced, they built, not perfectly, not cleanly, but undeniably. Let the echoes of their lives hum softly in your ear as you sleep. Let the creak of the wooden floor, the cry of distant coyotes, and the rustle of pages half written in time guide you into rest. You've survived the day. You've heard the truth behind the myth. And now you deserve your peace. Good night, traveler of time.